Hi everybody, my name's Carolyn Corbin. I'm a shipwright, and I am here to talk to you guys today about planking. So in our little lecture that we're going to do today, we're going to kind of go over like the general terms about planking, what species you use to plank, methods of determining where your planks are going to land, and actually, making or replacing a plank. This is not a comprehensive lesson on planking. There's a lot of ins and outs. As you might think, it's a large part of the boat, so there's a lot that is involved. So please, if I don't cover something that you are interested in this video, please ask it in the Q&A, and I will do my best to explain it. Today we're going to talk about carvel planking, which is what I have always done. It's kind of your standard European tradition, like plank on frame boat build. Where the planks butt together, and so it creates a smooth transition down the hull. And most of the Essex boats, actually I think all of the Essex boats were carvel planked. Carvel and lapstrake, but mostly carvel can work for rowboats, power boats, sailboats, schooners. Carvel planking, that's what the windjammers were, the grain running ships were. It's been around for a while. It's really stood the test of time. So for carvel planking, we have some really specific terms that we should talk about. So the most talked about plank, and the one that has its own name at the bottom, is that garboard plank. So the garboard is a really specific plank. It meets that rabbet. It is the first plank that usually goes on the boat, and it transfers all the stress from the rest of the hull to that keel timber. It's usually bigger. It's usually a weird shape to take up space in a really strange part of the hull. And it's often the plank seam that has the most issues because, again, just a lot of load is going onto that plank. So moving up from the garboard, I've written broads. If you don't have broads, kind of the collective term for these planks down here are called the lowers, your lower planking. And then collectively, everything above them is the topsides planking. And it's roughly divided into what's above the waterline and what's below the waterline. Really what it's divided by is something called the master line. We will get into the master line, but let's finish up some terms real quick. And then the top plank usually depends on the type of boat, but usually the very top plank is called the sheer. And the sheer technically is where the deck structure meets the outside of the hull. And that plank might also be thicker or stiffer or wider or something different, just to kind of give a little bit of extra pressure or, fastening space right there. So those are kind of the things. The bottom one is the garboard, the top one is the sheer, the upper or topside planks, the lowers, your keel. So I promised you we would talk about this rabbet thing down here, and I think this is a really important thing to hit for like planking concept. So let's move over to another part of the picture board. All right, so we're looking at the rabbet drawing here, and you again have got this keel. We're looking at half the picture. So the keel starts up here, goes down. This is your garboard plank that's coming in. And what you're seeing here, which I didn't say in the other video, but you might have caught it, where the little V-gaps between all the planks was the caulking bevel. So I promised to go back and explain the caulking bevel. But let's get through the rabbet first. This point specifically is called the rabbet, and it's a line that goes along the entire length of the backbone assembly. The rabbet is where the outside of the planking meets the outside of the keel. So that's a line that we have to know because it's the outside of the boat. That's as simple as that. So the opposite of the rabbet is the bearding line. That's where the inside of the planking touches the inside of the keel. And that's important to know because between the two of them, at a right angle is the back rabbet. And the back rabbet is where the very corner of the plank comes in. And that should be a right angle because your planking is cut at a right angle. So if you can cut a right angle groove all along the center line of the boat that matches the rabbet and bearding line for that part of the boat, then your whole planking should just snuck right into your center line and be really nice and seamless and a nice transition. While this is a right angle, the attitude of this angle will change throughout the boat. So if it's a really flat boat, the rabbet might be out here if your planking is coming off like a lobster boat. And if it's a really, really sharp part of the boat, say the bow, your rabbet might be pretty tight. And then, you know, the attitude will change as it runs along the boat. That's the trick of chopping the rabbet. So again, there's a lot to say about the rabbet, but that's a really good basic concept. It's the meeting joint between the backbone and the planking. All right, let's go back and talk about that master line. So this comes into play when you are building a new boat and you have to figure out how to plank your boat. Or if you're doing a complete repair or restoration, which is essentially at that point, you're putting new planking on the boat. You have no planking on the boat. You have nothing to take a pattern off of. Nothing exists. So what it does is it gives you a straight line on the boat. It gives you a starting point, and it's also the line that mostly divides your uppers or top sides from your lower planks. The master line is a place where on the boat, a straight plank fits nicely without any edge setting. And what I mean by that is that you can take a plank that doesn't have any shape cut into it, is just a straight board, and wrap it around the frame to the stem and stern and have it look straight. The best way to find a master line is to take a batten. And what I mean by batten is a piece of wood that's around the length of your plank. It should go from your stem to your stern, and it should be thin, but it should be wide. So that makes it stiff and flexible. It makes it stiff so it won't smile or frown. It's going to keep that nice stiff profile, but it'll be thinner than the rest of the planking, so you can actually physically manhandle it around the boat, because that's kind of hard to do. But if you want to get a good estimation of where your master line will be, and you have drafting or lofting, a really good sheeting way to do it is go to a section plan. And this is essentially what a section plan would look like. It's a slice of the boat. And so down here, in what is the lowers, we've got the turn of the bilge. So the bilge is kind of like the lower part of the inside of the boat. And this whole general area is called the turn of the bilge. And if we were to take our straight edge and kind of just get an attitude line for that. So just a general flow of where that turn of the bilge is. We might get something like that. And then if we were to take our top sides and kind of just follow the general attitude of our top sides, we might get something like that. And right here, where they meet, that's probably going to be our master line. That's probably going to be the spot where this plank, one of those two planks, is going to go on with a straight line and look nice. Above that, we can continue that trend. So all these planks above are generally built with one straight edge and they look fine. Down here in the lowers, you might be able to continue that straight line tread a little bit as you go down, but you're soon going to have to get into spiling or patterning. All right, so we're going to talk about patterning or spiling for a plank. And spiling is a way to take an exact pattern off of the plank below or above it so that you know exactly what line you should be cutting. So we've got a mock-up here of what your pattern might look like. It'll probably be plywood. I like to use door skin or something really thin and flexible. This is a little thick, but it's what I had right now. And you would have stapled or glued a stretch of plywood to fill the exact length of the void that you're planking. So again, this is just a mock-up for a short section, but really this piece would be pretty much fore to aft as long as we wanted the plank. And instead of clamping, usually you nail it in with some finish nails. That way it's actually touching all the frames, and the nails are out of your way, because you do need to access the entire width around the plank. So the other thing that I've done is I've used this piece of blue tape to denote, like, okay, so that's the width of the plank right there, that either the plank I took off and I'm replacing, that was where it stopped, or when I lined out, when I designed my boat, I knew that's how wide the plank was supposed to be at that frame. And there would be marks like that on each frame, either again where the old plank used to be or where the new plank should land. The first thing I'm gonna do with my bevel gauge and my bevel board is actually take some bevels. Now I should do this without the pattern there and write them on the frames before I put my pattern up, but for the sake of time, we're just gonna do them right now. So what I do is I wanna get an angle to the plank below it. And so I get my bevel gauge up there, I seat it there, and I look and say, okay, that's a good match for the plank below. And then I would take it to my bevel board. So we're looking at a 2-degree standing bevel. And when I mean standing bevel, so I'll just write that there, 2 degrees standing. And the important thing there is to know that we are going to the inside face of the plank. This whole process works on the inside face of the plank. And so from here to this part, the inside to outside, that's an angle that's growing. It's a standing bevel. If it was shrinking, if this plank was proud on the outside face, then it would be an under bevel. And those are really important to know the difference. And then to get the upper bevel, what I could do is I kind of have to do the same thing. I have to kind of hold the bevel gauge square to the plank, square to the frame, I mean, and then I should have another piece of equipment called a transit square. And what that does is it would just this plank and the plank above it have to come together in a nice conjoined fashion on a curved surface that is the frame. So I'm trying to bisect that angle that is this arc right here to find out what angle is best to put on the lower plank and what angle will be best to put on the upper plank so they can meet around that curved surface. So I would get my angle, and it's probably also going to be a standing bevel, so I would just put X degrees standing. So now I've got a bevel on top and bottom of this part of the plank. Great, bevels are done. I'm gonna take my dividers and say, okay, from the base of the previous plank to the top of my other plank, I'm gonna swing an arc. And I want the height of that arc to just be at that line with my dividers. So then I'm gonna go down here to my pattern and I'm gonna scribe that arc. So I'm gonna put a nice hole and I'm just gonna scribe that arc. What I'm gonna do, just to make it more visible, circle the point, draw a line, circle the arc. So I know this width, this measurement is how wide that plank needs to be at that spot. And again, just to make sure we all know where we are, I personally just put a little vertical mark to show the center of that frame. So that's where that center arc should be swung on this pattern. So at this point, we have the width of the plank, we have the angle of the plank, but where does that width start? From this piece, we don't actually know where to start that measurement. And that's where spiling comes in. So spiling is essentially transferring a pattern in space. So I've got my spiling block here. So you can see it's got a funny shape. And this is a spiling block specifically to spile to the inside face of a plank. We're not going to go into spiling into the outside face. We're just going to stick with this because this is what I have a visual exaction for. And this notch that I cut out of the plank, of the spiling block, this height here is the exact height of my pattern piece. So I cut this so that it would be flush with whatever surface that the plank pattern is sitting on. If I were to put this on a table, the plank pattern would sit nicely underneath of it, and this would also touch the table. And that's important because what I'm going to do with my spiling block is run it along the bottom edge of my pattern and touch the plank below it so that the entire way across I can get all the way into the frame. I guess I'm out of the frame, but yeah, you can see that this slides nicely along the surface of the pattern and touches the plank below it. And I'm just going to take this and my pencil and I'm going to trace the entire bottom of the plank. I could also just do it at each frame. That might be more accurate because that way my spiling block can't rock in and out. But this gives me the exact shape of the plank below it. So you know that this is the spiling mark. You know that's where you're going to start your width. So when I put this down on my new plank stock, I can do several things. First thing, I'm actually going to take my whole pattern to the bandsaw and cut it off at that spiling mark. so that I can, when I go back to my pattern, I can do the opposite of what I did before. I can take that spiling mark. Because we're going to the inside face of the planking, it requires us to flip the pattern over. If that doesn't make sense to you, just trust me on this, it does. I will get into it if I have time. But on our pattern, we now have all the information that we need. We have the exact shape of the plank below it. We have the widths at each frame to go from there to the width that the plank needs to be. And we have the rolling bevel to cut on the sides of the plank. So at this point, with a friend, I could gently take this pattern down and lay it down on my pattern stock and cut and spile a new plank. So here we're looking at Arabella, and I just wanted to give a better visual indication of that rabbet. So this is the stem post, and you can see this is where that rabbet is. It's where those planks meet into the backbone. And if you look this way, you can see that they fit nice and flush, outside of plank to outside of keel. And you don't see the thickness of the plank because it's stuck into the rabbet. Now you're saying, okay, there's this huge gap here. There's these huge gaps in between planks. So this is that caulking bevel I was talking about. And basically when you put the planks together along the boat, you don't necessarily have to make them meet all the way from the inside to the outside face. That you could do it, but Shipwrights came up with a really cool thing to do, which is called caulking, and there's a whole series on caulking, I'm sure, coming up. But basically you open up the plank from the bottom third is nice and tight, and the top two, the outmost 2/3, open up into like a 3 to 5 degree angle, and then you shove in cotton, oakum, and then some sort of paying compound, some sort of goo over top of that all. And when you caulk every plank seam, it swells the whole thing shut like a drum and just adds so much stability and structural integrity to the boat. So that's how you make a plank. Obviously it takes a lot of fitting. Once you actually get the plank made up, oftentimes you make up the blank, you throw it in the steam box for however long it takes. It's usually an hour per thickness, an hour per inch of thickness of the wood. And then you take a team of friends and you shove it onto the boat. If it's a plank that's going on and there's a space above or below it, it's really nice because then you can clamp, you can get a lot of pressure, and you can get your fingers in and around it. And that's really handy. Plus you're only fitting one edge. So if you're fitting a closed plank, which is called a shutter plank, it means that there's a plank above and a plank below it, and you gotta fit this thing in there. You've gotta be really accurate on your bevels. And you never wanna fit a shutter plank that has standing bevels from the outside, which means that the plank is wider on the inside than it is on the outside. So that's kind of the very basics of planking. We're gonna take a look at some of the Acorn to Arabella guys. They weren't able to do a master line, but they had a really cool pattern that they came up with, which involved pretty much straight edge planks all the way around with a few modifications. So we'll take a look at them, check in with them, and then I think it'll be time for some Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, we'll go live after our next little interview bit, and I'll see you then. Thanks so much for watching. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
So this is Steve from Acorn to Arabella, and this is Arabella. So we've been talking about planking, Steve, and we've been using Arabella as an example. But you guys did not use your master line when you were designing plank widths. Why not?
Correct. Because she's a beamy double ender, and what ultimately ends up happening is if you find the master line on the hull, it's up near the shear at the stem and the stern, and it's buried way down low at midship. And essentially, if you were to plank with the master line, all of your top side planks would need to be like 8 inches in the middle and 1 inch, something like that, in stem and stern, which would be a pretty ridiculous plank to put on the boat.
So how did you determine how wide your planks were going to be once you framed Arabella up? How did you figure out how many planks you were going to put on?
Well, Atkins says, I think 22 strakes per side, so you can go with that.
It's nice to work off of plans.
But, you know, as numerous boat builders said, well, that's how Atkins would have planked the boat. So you can do more, you can do less. When we took measurements, we found that the distance from the rabbet to the shear at midship was just about the same distance from the rabbet to the shear at stem and stern. I think there's like a whopping 1 foot difference, which is pretty mind-boggling, but that's how it works out. So the distance for the planks, they don't really need much taper. So when we were talking with a very experienced boat builder, his suggestion was that we just do diminishing boards for the stem and stern, and we just immediately start hanging planks, and they'll taper and just build up from the guard board to the shear. And we did that, and the issue that we ran into is the planks started to really frown because we were building up more at midship. And at some point they would have switched and they would have started to give you your smile as we got closer to the shear. But we were having to edge set more and more, and we were building kind of tensions into the boat, and it was getting harder and harder to plank. So we talked to a couple other shipwrights, and what we realized is that we needed to do something to build up the distance at the stem and the stern for a little bit. So we ultimately ended up putting in a steeler here in the stern, and we put, I don't know, what we're calling a fishtail plank right above it. So this makes up a bunch of difference, and then the fishtail plank, as we call it, is wider at stem and stern than it is at midship. And that gave us a much better sweep for the following planks, which ended up going on the boat a lot easier. As long as the planks are on the boat and cocked tight, at the end of the day, it's okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.